to go to Secretary of State Blinken. He is in Brussels. Let's listen in and we'll come back to that.
And I made clear then the commitment of the United States to Israel's security and to ensuring that October 7th could never happen again. I also underscored Israel's moral, strategic, and legal requirements to protect civilians and provide humanitarian assistance to those who needed it. Now, of course, what happened after October 7th could have ended immediately if Hamas had stopped hiding behind civilians, released the hostages, and put down its weapons. But Israel is not Hamas. Israel is a democracy. Hamas, a terrorist organization. And democracies place the highest value on human life, every human life. As has been said, whoever saves a life saves the entire world. That's our strength. It's what distinguishes us from terrorists like Hamas. If we lose that reverence for human life, we risk becoming indistinguishable from those we confront. Here's the current reality in Gaza. Despite important steps that Israel has taken to allow assistance into Gaza, the results on the ground are woefully insufficient and unacceptable. 100% of the population in Gaza knows acute levels of food insecurity. 100% of the population is in need of humanitarian assistance. And those working heroically to provide that assistance are doing so in great peril to their own lives. This week's horrific attack on the World Central Kitchen was not the first such incident. It must be the last. President Biden spoke a short while ago with Prime Minister Netanyahu. The leaders discussed the situation in Gaza. The president emphasized that the strikes on humanitarian workers and the overall humanitarian situation are unacceptable. He made clear the need for Israel to announce a series of specific, concrete, and measurable steps to address civilian harm, humanitarian suffering, and the safety of aid workers. He made clear that U.S. policy with respect to Gaza will be determined by our assessment of Israel's immediate action on these steps. He underscored as well that an immediate ceasefire is essential to stabilize and improve the humanitarian situation and protect innocent civilians, and he urged Prime Minister Netanyahu to empower his negotiators to conclude a deal without delay to bring the hostages home. The two leaders also discussed public Iranian threats against Israel and the Israeli people. President Biden reaffirmed the United States' strong support for Israel in the face of these threats and our commitment to Israel's security. Right now, there is no higher priority in Gaza than protecting civilians, surging humanitarian assistance, and ensuring the security of those who provide it. Israel must meet this moment.
We've been listening to the Secretary of State Antony Blinken at NATO headquarters on the 75th anniversary of the founding of the organization. He's live in Brussels, Belgium. Some significant remarks when it comes to the conflict in Gaza. The Secretary of State saying that he has communicated to Israeli officials not only the U.S.'s commitment to Israel and its war against Hamas, but also the moral obligation that Israel has to protect civilians and aid workers in the Gaza Strip. He specifically said, and I quote, "If we lose reverence for human life, we become indistinguishable from them, from Hamas terrorists." He described the efforts so far by Israel since October 7th to protect civilians and humanitarian aid workers as woefully inadequate. And he laid out what we just got a readout from the call that President Biden had with the Prime Minister, that the United States would consider its approach to Israel based on concrete steps to change the way that Israel has handled civilians and aid workers.
That's right. They're expecting data from Israel, which is clear. He said that they need to have concrete, measurable steps to address harm to civilians, civilian suffering and also to aid workers. And he said that U.S. Aid to Gaza may be determined by those steps. That's essentially what he said. And this is really significant because it comes on the heel of a very close Biden ally, Senator Coons, talking this morning about being open to putting conditions on aid to Israel, which is really the first time that we have heard the administration go so far. And this is even as we're hearing from a senior administration official that the policy hasn't changed, that the president is frustrated the policy hasn't changed. This is signaling a potential policy change. So nonetheless, this is big.
Absolutely. Notably, the timing of the apparent accidental strike coming almost a day after the U.S. announced this enormous deal, $18 billion to sell F-15 fighter jets to Israel. The question now being, is this rhetoric that actually moves the needle, or do there have to be conditions on arms in order to get Prime Minister Netanyahu and some of the other Israeli officials to carry out significant change in the way that they've been conducting the war? We have with us retired Colonel Cedric Leighton to give us some perspective. Colonel Leighton, from what you heard from the Secretary of State there, it is a noticeable shift, saying that the policy toward Israel will change, determined on the way that Israel conducts its operations in Gaza.
Absolutely. And in essence, what we're talking about, Boris, here is conditioning the aid on Israeli conduct going forward. And I guess in this case, you can kind of say past is prologue, because the past conduct of Israeli operations has not met U.S. standards. And at this point in time, it appears as if the Department of Defense and the administration are looking at changing the policy potentially, where they actually say, look, you cannot use these weapons against civilian targets. You cannot use these weapons against aid workers. And that's the kind of thing that I think might be happening here. Whether or not it does, of course, is going to be borne out in the next few days probably. But you mentioned the F-15 sale to Israel. That's something that's going to take place over the next 4 or 5 years in order to actually get those weapons to the Israelis. But the other part of this is they have already delivered, in the process of delivering more 2,000-pound bombs to Israel. That's a much more immediate thing. It's going to be interesting to see whether or not that delivery is stopped before they actually are put into Israeli airplanes for potential use. And that's going to be a significant thing. There are two things that the Israelis, that the U.S. is worried about with Israel. One of them is the immediate conduct in Gaza. The second thing is using Israel as a buffer against Iran. And that is going to be kind of the balancing act that the administration has to deal with at this point.
Let's listen in to Admiral Kirby.
And the overall humanitarian situation in Gaza are unacceptable. He made clear the need for Israel to announce and to implement a series of specific, concrete, and measurable steps to address civilian harm, humanitarian suffering, and the safety of aid workers. He made clear that U.S. policy with respect to Gaza will be determined by our assessment of Israel's immediate action on these steps. He underscored that an immediate ceasefire is essential to stabilize and improve the humanitarian situation and to protect innocent civilians. And he urged the Prime Minister to empower his negotiators to conclude a deal without delay to bring the hostages home. The two leaders also discussed public Iranian threats against Israel and the Israeli people. President Biden made clear that the United States strongly supports Israel in the face of those threats. That's all I have.
Admiral, you're not specifying what concrete steps Israel must take exactly.
I gave you some a broad sense of it. We want to see more crossings opened up. We want to see more trucks getting in, particularly from Jordan. We want to see tangible steps at the mitigation of civilian harm, particularly to humanitarian aid workers, but obviously all civilians. But we want to see that they have moved forward on proper steps to deconflict with aid workers as they move around, that the information flow is viable.
Sure, but that's language we've heard for weeks now. You're not talking about sort of telling us how exactly you will measure those measurable steps, right?
What I said was, we're going to examine our policy approaches based on our assessment of the way the Israeli side modifies their behavior, modifies their policy and decision-making processes. And so, first of all, let's see what they say they're going to do. and then let's watch and see how they execute to what they say. And I don't want to get ahead of them on what they plan to say about the changes they're going to make, but we'll base our policy decisions based on an assessment of how they execute to their policy decisions.
And you're not talking about what potential U.S. policy changes are on the table. Can you say whether the president shared that with the prime minister on this phone call?
The president made clear that that absent changes in the protection of civilians on the ground, absent changes to the volume of humanitarian assistance getting in, absent any movement on a ceasefire that will allow hostages to get out and more aid to get in, absent, a calming down, that he will have to reconsider his own policy choices with respect to Gaza.